My wife referred to me as her cabin boy. Then I showed her how brutal my mutiny could be. Jonathan stood in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water, when he heard Evelyn's laughter drift in from the living room. Her friends were over, Sophia and Claire, and the three of them had been chatting for nearly an hour. He hadn't paid much attention until he heard his name. "Oh, please," Evelyn said, her voice rich with amusement. "You think Mark is whipped? You should see my cabin boy." Jonathan jumps to refill my wine before I even notice it's empty. The women laughed, and something in Jonathan's chest tightened. Cabin boy. It wasn't the first time she'd called him something like that in front of others. He leaned against the counter, staring into his water glass, replaying the moments in his head. There was the dinner party last month, where she'd patted his cheek and told everyone, "He's lucky I keep him around, can't even grill a steak right." Polite chuckles all around. Then there was the time at the beach, when he'd brought her the wrong sunscreen, and she'd sighed loudly, rolling her eyes for their friends. Classic Jonathan. Can't trust him with the simplest tasks. Even small things, like when he'd mispronounced a word at a bookstore, and she'd corrected him with a smirk, adding, "My husband, the intellectual." He had always laughed it off, told himself it was just Evelyn's sense of humor. But now, standing alone in the kitchen, the weight of those moments settled over him. He didn't say anything that night. He refilled Evelyn's wine when she asked, smiled when she made another playful jab, and kissed her cheek when her friends left. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he wondered how long he'd been quietly shrinking himself to fit into the space she allowed him. And, for the first time, he considered what it might feel like to step out of it. The next morning, Jonathan sat at the kitchen table, stirring his coffee absently, the steam curling into the air like the slow unraveling of his thoughts. Evelyn was still asleep, and the quiet of the house gave him too much space to think. Memories flickered behind his eyes, not just the recent ones, but years of them, stacking up like old receipts he'd never bothered to examine. There was his 40th birthday, when he'd planned a weekend getaway for the two of them, a cozy bed and breakfast by the lake. Evelyn had scoffed when they arrived. "Really, Jonathan? I thought you'd at least spring for a resort. This is so quaint." She'd posted a photo anyway, captioned, "My sweet, simple man tried his best." Then there were the holidays. Every Christmas, he'd spend hours wrapping presents with meticulous care, only for her to sigh and say, "You used the wrong paper again. I told you gold, not red." One year, she'd even rewrapped them all herself while their friends watched, laughing as she said, "Someone has to save this disaster." But the sharpest memories cut deeper. Late-night whispers, overheard through the bedroom door when Evelyn thought he was asleep. "Honestly, sometimes I just fake it to get it over with," she'd murmured to someone on the phone. A giggle. "No, he tries, bless his heart. But you know how it is with uncoordinated men." At the time, he'd brushed it off, told himself she was just venting. Now, the humiliation burned fresh. How many of her friends knew? How many of their dinner guests had exchanged knowing glances when Evelyn made one of her playful remarks about his stamina or creativity? And the worst part? He'd let it happen. He'd laughed along, shrugged it off, told himself it was just how Evelyn was, blunt, unfiltered, no nonsense. But now, with the clarity of distance, he saw it for what it was, a slow erosion. A way to keep him small, to make sure he never forgot his place, as her accessory, her cabin boy. His fingers tightened around the coffee mug. How many other things had he dismissed? The way she'd roll her eyes when he talked about his hobbies. The way she'd joke about his cooking, his driving, even the way he dressed. "Oh, don't mind him," she'd say to guests. "He's hopeless." Hopeless. The word echoed in his skull. Jonathan set the mug down carefully, the ceramic clicking against the counter. For the first time in years, he didn't feel hopeless. He felt something else. Something dangerous. The scent of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as Jonathan stared out the window, lost in the past. Before Evelyn had ever called him her cabin boy, before the years of little humiliations, there had been heat. A time when she couldn't keep her hands off him, when her sharp tongue had felt thrilling instead of cutting. But even then, especially then, she had shaped him. He remembered the first time she had undressed him, her fingers pausing as she traced the faint softness of his stomach. "You'd be perfect if you just tightened up here," she'd murmured, as if she were doing him a favor by pointing it out. He'd started working out the next day. Or the way, after their first few nights together, she'd sighed and said, "You're so eager." "It's cute. But you'll learn." And he had learned, to watch her reactions, to follow her cues, to let her set the pace. At the time, he'd mistaken it for passion. Now, he saw it for what it was, control. The creak of the stairs pulled him back to the present. Evelyn padded into the kitchen, her silk robe swaying, her hair effortlessly tousled. She didn't greet him, just reached for the coffee he'd already poured for her and took a sip. Her nose wrinkled. Here it comes. Mmm. Almost perfect, she said, setting the mug down. Just a touch too bitter today. Did you use the dark roast instead of the medium? He had, in fact, used the exact beans she preferred. He'd measured the grounds, timed the brew, even warmed the mug the way she liked. But it didn't matter. There was always something. I'll make a note of it, he said, his voice neutral. She smiled, patting his shoulder as she passed. That's my good cabin boy. The words slithered under his skin. He watched her as she settled at the table, scrolling through her phone, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him. For years, he had believed her criticisms were just Evelyn being Evelyn, her high standards, her sharp tongue, her refusal to settle for anything less than perfection. But now, he saw the truth. It was never about the coffee. It was never about the gifts, or the holidays, or the way he touched her. It was about making sure he knew, deep in his bones, that he would never be enough. And for the first time, a question flickered in his mind. What if I am? He finished his coffee in silence. Then he stood, walked to the sink, and rinsed his mug, slowly, deliberately. When he turned around, Evelyn barely glanced up. But he was looking at her. Really looking. And for the first time, he didn't see a queen. He saw a woman who needed him to be small so she could feel big. And he was done playing cabin boy. Jonathan went through the motions of the day like a ghost drifting through his own life. At work, he stared at his computer screen, unseeing, while memories played behind his eyes like a cruel highlight reel. The time he'd surprised Evelyn with concert tickets to her favorite band, only for her to frown and say, "You got nosebleed seats? I'd rather not go than sit in the rafters like some broke college kid." He'd scrambled to resell them and buy floor seats at double the price. The way she playfully rolled her eyes at dinner parties when he told a story. "Oh God, here we go," she'd sigh, as if his very voice was an inconvenience. The time he'd worn a new shirt, something he thought looked sharp, and she'd smirked and said, trying to impress someone else, in that tone, the one that wasn't quite a joke, the one that made him immediately second-guess himself. Each memory was a tiny cut, but together, they bled and dry. Worst of all were the times she'd weaponized his past. He'd once confessed, early in their marriage, that his father had called him soft as a boy, too sensitive, too eager to please. Evelyn had stored that away like ammunition. "You're being so emotional, right now," she'd say when he tried to voice an opinion. "Is this one of your soft moments?" She'd taken every insecurity he'd ever shared and sharpened them into knives. And he'd let her. Because somewhere along the way, he'd started believing her. His phone buzzed, a text from Evelyn. "Don't forget the dry cleaning. And pick up the wine for tonight. Not the cheap one you got last time." He stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the screen. For years, he'd jumped to respond, to prove he'd listened, that he was good enough. Now he deleted the notification without replying. Something inside him had shifted. The cabin boy was done jumping at orders. And the man was finally waking up. Jonathan stood in the wine aisle, staring at the bottles. Evelyn had demanded a specific vintage, the Cabernet from that little vineyard in Napa, not the one you brought last time, the good one. Instead, his fingers closed around a different bottle, the Mariner's Red, its label adorned with a subtle etching of a ship's helm. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't the one she wanted. A small act of rebellion. He almost smiled. Next, he stopped at a home goods store. He wandered past shelves of bland, neutral decor until he found it, a sleek lighthouse lamp, its beam a soft golden glow when he tested the switch. Then, cloth napkins, each embroidered with a tiny ship's wheel in navy, cream, and slate gray. Tasteful. Understated. But undeniably nautical. That evening, their guests arrived, Evelyn's usual circle of polished, sharp-tongued friends. Jonathan played the part of dutiful host, pouring wine while Evelyn held court. "Oh, what's this?" Claire asked, swirling the Mariner's Red in her glass. "I don't think I've had this one before." "Jonathan's little experiment," Evelyn said, her voice laced with amusement. "He's developed a theme tonight, apparently." Sophia glanced at the lighthouse lamp, then the napkins, and smirked. "Ah. I see it now. Very coastal." "It's charming," Claire offered, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. Evelyn sighed, as if indulging a child. "Well, at least he's trying to be creative. Even if it's a bit on the nose." She shot Jonathan a look, "We'll discuss this later," before turning back to her guests. "But really, the real star is the sea bass. I had to walk him through the recipe 3 times before he got it right." The table laughed. Jonathan sipped his wine, his expression unreadable. Later, as the guests left, Claire paused at the door. "You know, the nautical thing is actually kind of fun. Maybe lean into it next time, go full sailor." She winked, as if it were a joke. Evelyn rolled her eyes. God, don't encourage him. When the door closed, Evelyn turned to him, arms crossed. What was that about? Jonathan met her gaze, calm. Just trying something new. She stared at him for a long moment, as if sensing something shifting beneath the surface. Then she scoffed. Well, next time, ask before you turn our house into a boat. She strode off, leaving him standing in the foyer. He glanced at the lighthouse lamp, its beam casting a warm glow across the room. Let her scoff. This was just the beginning. Jonathan's quiet rebellion became a carefully charted course. He replaced the sleek, modern fruit bowl on their dining table with one made of weathered driftwood. Evelyn noticed immediately, running her fingers along the rough edges with a frown. Where did this come from? Antique shop, he said without looking up from his book. It's got character. She wrinkled her nose but said nothing. A few days later, a framed map of the Caribbean, aged to look like an old pirate's treasure chart, appeared in the hallway. Evelyn barely glanced at it, assuming it was just another one of Jonathan's quirks. But then the knots started appearing. A coiled rope tied in a neat bowline on the mantel. A decorative anchor-shaped hook by the front door. A throw pillow with a tasteful embroidered compass rose. Still, Evelyn dismissed it all as Jonathan's little phase. Until the humming. What is that? She snapped one evening as he absent-mindedly whistled the Wellerman while chopping vegetables. Oh, just something I heard. He didn't tell her it was a song about a ship's crew starving their cruel captain into submission. She eyed him suspiciously before turning away. Then came the books. Moby Dick on the coffee table. Treasure Island nestled among their decorative hardcovers. A weathered copy of 2 years before the mast left casually on his nightstand. Evelyn picked it up one night, flipping through the pages with a scoff. Since when do you read sailing memoirs? Since now, he said simply. She stared at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if sensing something shifting beneath the surface. But then she shrugged and tossed the book back onto the nightstand. Whatever. Just don't start dressing like a fisherman. Jonathan smiled to himself as she walked away. Oh, she had no idea. The cabin boy was studying. And soon, he'd be ready to mutiny. Jonathan had spent years internalizing Evelyn's critiques, both the overt and the subtle, about his performance in the bedroom. You're so predictable. Is that all you've got? Maybe next time, try lasting longer than 5 minutes. Each comment had carved another notch in his confidence, until he'd accepted her verdict as fact. But no more. His research led him to a discreet, upscale workshop called The Art of Sensual Mastery, held in a private studio downtown. The instructor, a poised woman named Lillian, taught techniques that went beyond the mechanical, slow, deliberate methods of touch, breath, and anticipation designed to unravel a partner completely. Jonathan practiced on a pillow at first, memorizing the precise pressure points, the rhythm of alternating strokes, the way to tease pleasure to the edge before pulling back, over and over, until the body trembled with need. He studied the science of arousal, the psychology of seduction, and, most importantly, the art of control. Then came the pharmaceutical assist. A small, unassuming bottle of antihistamines, known for their side effects, sat in his nightstand drawer. One pill, taken an hour beforehand, would ensure he could maintain his endurance far beyond what Evelyn had ever experienced. And he would make her experience it. The night he decided to test his newfound skills, he prepared meticulously. A single pill. A shower scented with sandalwood, a note of musk, subtle but intoxicating. He dressed in dark linen pants, nothing else, letting the definition of his torso, still honed from years of her demanded workouts, speak for itself. Evelyn barely glanced up from her phone when he entered the bedroom. You're still awake, she remarked, as if it were an inconvenience. I was thinking, he said, his voice low, about how long it's been since I really touched you. That got her attention. She smirked. Oh? And what makes you think you know how to really touch me? Instead of answering, he crossed the room, took the phone from her hand, and set it aside. Then, with deliberate slowness, he traced a single fingertip down the side of her neck, just as Lillian had taught. Evelyn's breath hitched. What? He didn't let her finish. His hands, strong, sure, glided over her shoulders, down her arms, then back up in a motion that was part massage, part caress. He pressed his thumbs into the precise spot at the base of her skull that made her spine arch involuntarily. Jonathan, her voice was sharper now, but there was a waver in it. He ignored her, focusing instead on the hitch in her breath as he mapped her body with a patience he'd never shown before. Every flick of his tongue, every graze of his teeth, every slow, circling touch was calculated to undo her. And it worked. Evelyn, who had always dictated their intimacy, who had always held the power, now clutched at the sheets, her usual composure shattered. Wait. No, he murmured against her skin. Not yet. He drew it out until she was trembling, until her nails dug into his shoulders, until she was pleading in a way she'd never done before. And when he finally let her fall over the edge, it was with a cry that was almost a sob. Afterward, she lay breathless, her skin flushed, her eyes dazed. Jonathan leaned down, brushing his lips against her ear. Still predictable? Evelyn didn't answer. For the first time in their marriage, she was the one left speechless. The night stretched on, heavy with silence and unspoken need. Jonathan lay beside Evelyn, close enough to feel the restless shift of her body, the way her breath hitched when she thought he wasn't listening. He pretended to sleep, his back turned, his breathing steady, while she seated in quiet frustration. 3 nights. Then 4. By the 5th, she cracked. He felt the mattress dip as she rolled toward him, her hand sliding over his hip in a hesitant caress. "Jonathan," she murmured, her voice thick with uncharacteristic need. He didn't move. Her fingers tightened, nails biting just slightly into his skin. "I know you're awake." Slowly, he turned to face her. Moonlight cut through the blinds, casting sharp lines across her face, her lips parted, her pupils wide, her usual mask of control slipping. She looked hungry. "Good." He let her push him onto his back, let her climb over him, her hair falling around them like a curtain. Her mouth crashed into his, desperate, impatient, but he didn't respond the way she wanted. Instead, he gripped her wrists and flipped her beneath him in one smooth motion, pinning her with the full weight of his body. She gasped. "You don't get to rush this," he said, his voice low, deliberate. Then he began. Every touch was calculated. Every kiss, every bite, every slow drag of his fingers was designed to unravel her. He worked her body with the precision of a man who had studied every inch of her, not out of love, but out of strategy. Evelyn, who had always dictated the terms, who had always held the power, now writhed beneath him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please." The word was a shock. Evelyn didn't beg. But she did now. He didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The antihistamine's effect was in full force, his own pleasure dulled to near nothingness, leaving only the cold satisfaction of control. He watched her come apart beneath him, her body arching, her fingers clawing at the sheets, her voice breaking on his name. And when it was over, when she lay boneless and gasping, he rolled away without a word. She reached for him, her fingers brushing his arm. "Jonathan." He didn't turn. "Sleep, Evelyn." Silence. Then, quietly, the rustle of sheets as she shifted away. Jonathan stared at the ceiling, his jaw tight. She ached for him now. But the cruelest twist. He felt nothing. And for the first time, he wondered. Was this victory? Or just another kind of defeat? The house had become a carefully curated museum of maritime motifs, each piece a silent rebellion. A brass ship's clock ticked away on the mantel. A vintage diving helmet sat on a shelf, hollow-eyed and watchful. A framed print of the raft of the Medusa hung in the study, its desperate figures a fitting metaphor. Evelyn barely noticed. She was too preoccupied with the gnawing hunger Jonathan had awakened in her, and the slow, suffocating death of her affair with Mark. Jonathan knew every detail. The tiny microphone hidden in the lighthouse lamp had captured Evelyn's frustrated phone calls, her hissed arguments with Mark about his sudden lack of creativity in bed. The camera nestled in the ship's wool napkin holder had caught her rolling her eyes at her phone, texting, "You're being pathetic. It's not my fault he's better than you now." Jonathan had smiled when he saw that. Better. Not good. Not satisfying. Better than Mark. It was a small, petty victory, but he'd take it. His meetings with the divorce attorney were clinical, efficient. "Emotional abuse is difficult to prove," the attorney said, flipping through the files of recordings. "But this? The infidelity, the verbal degradation, it's textbook. And with the prenup's infidelity clause." Jonathan nodded. The prenup Evelyn had insisted on, the one she'd been so sure would protect her, would now gut her. He almost felt guilty. Almost. The final piece arrived on a Thursday, a handsome wooden ship's figurehead, a mermaid with a knowing smile. He placed it in the foyer, where Evelyn would see it every day. That night, as they lay in bed, she turned to him, her fingers trailing down his chest. "Jonathan." He looked at her, at the woman who had spent years whittling him down to nothing. At the woman who had laughed at him, belittled him, betrayed him. At the woman who now ached for him. He cupped her face, thumb brushing her lower lip. "No." Her eyes widened. "What?" "I said no." He dropped his hand, rolled onto his side. "Sleep, Evelyn." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Then, quietly, furiously, "You can't just ignore me." Jonathan closed his eyes. Oh, but he could. And he would. The cabin boy was done jumping at her command. The captain was steering the ship now. And soon, she'd be the one thrown overboard. The bookshop cafe was quiet, the scent of roasted beans and old paper thick in the air. Jonathan sat near the window, a well-worn copy of the Count of Monte Cristo open in front of him, a fitting choice, he thought. He didn't have to wait long. Sophie walked in, her designer sunglasses perched atop her head, her fingers drumming impatiently against her phone. When she spotted him, her steps faltered. Jonathan? He looked up, feigning surprise. Sophie. Fancy running into you here. She slid into the chair across from him, her curiosity piqued. I didn't take you for a reader. There's a lot about me people don't seem to know, he said lightly, closing the book. Their conversation was casual at first, coffee, the weather, mutual acquaintances. Then, carefully, he steered it toward Evelyn. Things have been better between us lately, he mused, stirring his coffee. More intense, if that makes sense. Sophie's grip tightened around her cup. Funny. Mark's been the opposite. Distant. Moody. Jonathan let the silence hang before sighing. Men get like that sometimes. Especially when they're preoccupied. Her eyes flickered. What do you mean? He shrugged. Evelyn's been out a lot lately. Meetings, errands. You know how she is, always on the move. Sophie's face went very still. Jonathan reached across the table, patting the back of her hand. I'm sure it's nothing. But the seed was planted. Over the next few weeks, Sophie and Jonathan met more often, coffees, lunches, accidental run-ins. Each time, he fed her another breadcrumb. Evelyn was out late last Tuesday. Said it was a work thing. Mark missed dinner again? That's odd, Evelyn was working late too. Sophie's suspicion hardened into certainty. Then, one evening, after a particularly tense phone call with Mark, who was, unbeknownst to her, tangled in sheets with Evelyn, Sophie showed up at Jonathan's door, her eyes red-rimmed, her voice shaking. Tell me I'm wrong. He didn't. Instead, he poured her a drink, let her cry, and then, when she reached for him, he gave her the same calculated pleasure he'd given Evelyn. Sophie gasped, shuddered, broke in his arms. Afterward, she stared at the ceiling, dazed. How did you? Jonathan traced idle circles on her shoulder. Practice. Then, quietly, he laid out his plan. Evelyn's birthday party was a lavish affair, champagne, canapes, their home filled with her smug, glittering friends. Jonathan played the dutiful husband, refilling glasses, laughing at jokes, his hand resting lightly on the small of Evelyn's back. Then, right as the cake was brought out, the front door opened. Sophie walked in. The room froze. Mark, mid-sip, choked on his champagne. Evelyn's smile turned brittle. Sophie. We didn't expect. I know, Sophie said sweetly. Then she turned to the crowd, holding up her phone. But I thought everyone should see this. She tapped the screen. The room filled with the unmistakable sound of Evelyn and Mark, panting, moaning, betraying. Evelyn's face drained of color. What the, Jonathan? He shrugged, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded stack of papers. Happy birthday, Evelyn. I got you a divorce. Sophie stepped forward, her voice icy. And Mark? I'd say it's over. The room erupted. Jonathan didn't stay to watch the fallout. He simply picked up his coat, walked out the door, and breathed in the cold, clean air of freedom. The cabin boy was gone. And the captain? He was just getting started. Jonathan's new apartment was quiet, blissfully so. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional buzz of his old phone lighting up with Evelyn's increasingly frantic messages. Jonathan, please. We need to talk. You don't understand, it wasn't what it looked like. Answer me. He didn't. Instead, he sipped his coffee and watched the sunrise through the window, the first light of dawn painting the sky in gold and crimson. Poetic, he thought. A new day. A new life. By now, Evelyn would have found the gifts he left behind, the screenshots tucked into Moby Dick, the DVD swapped out for her own betrayal, the damning recordings of every cruel word she'd ever hissed at him. The house, once her domain, was now a museum of her own undoing. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Sophie. Meet you at the lawyer's in an hour. You ready? Jonathan smirked. Born ready. The attorney's office was sleek, modern, the kind of place where fortunes were dismantled behind closed doors. Sophie was already there, perched on the edge of a leather chair, her nails tapping nervously against her knee. When she saw him, her face lit up, relief, hunger, something dangerously close to affection. You okay? She asked softly. Never better, he lied. The attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Castillo, wasted no time. Evelyn's been served. She's panicking. Mark's lawyer is already scrambling. She slid a folder across the table. With the prenup's infidelity clause and the evidence of abuse, she's looking at virtually nothing in the settlement. As for Sophie's case, Sophie's jaw tightened. Mark won't know what hit him. Jonathan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Sophie had been a means to an end, a pawn in his game, just as he had been in hers. She'd laughed along with Evelyn's cruelty for years. She'd enabled Mark's betrayal. And now, she looked at Jonathan like he was some kind of savior. Pathetic. But useful. That night, Sophie came to his apartment, her body thrumming with adrenaline, her hands already reaching for him. "We did it," she breathed against his mouth. "They're finished." Jonathan let her push him onto the bed, let her undress him, let her believe this was anything but another calculated move. He gave her the same relentless pleasure he'd mastered, the slow build, the unbearable tease, the crescendo that left her gasping. Again. And again. "Jonathan, God, how do you?" He didn't answer. He just kept going, pushing her past the point of pleasure into near pain, until she was sobbing his name, her fingers clawing at the sheets. Then, abruptly, he stopped. Sophie blinked up at him, dazed. "What?" Jonathan stood, grabbing his robe. "I'm tired." Her face crumpled. "But, we were just..." "Good night, Sophie." He left her there, naked and trembling, the same cold ache settling in her stomach that Evelyn now knew so well. The next morning, Sophie's texts went unanswered. Evelyn's calls continued to flood his old phone, now silenced in a drawer. Jonathan dressed slowly, methodically, his reflection in the mirror a stranger, sharper, colder, free. He had won. Evelyn was ruined. Sophie would soon realize she'd been used. And as for him? The cabin boy was dead. Long live the captain. He picked up his keys, locked the door behind him, and walked away without looking back. The notification blinked on Jonathan's screen, a birthday reminder for Evelyn. A year ago, that name would have sent a spike of anger through him. Now, it barely registered. He swiped it away without a second thought, then leaned back in his chair, staring out the window of his quiet, minimalist apartment. The past 12 months had been a study in detachment. The divorce had been swift, brutal, and, thanks to Evelyn's own infidelity and the mountain of evidence against her, remarkably one-sided. No alimony. No shared assets. Just a clean severance, as clinical as a scalpel slice. Sophie's separation from Mark had been messy, tangled up in custody battles and bitter accusations. Jonathan had watched from a distance, occasionally responding to her late-night texts with nothing more than a "not tonight." He'd let her ache, let her hunger for the pleasure he'd once given her, the pleasure he now deliberately withheld. He'd learned that lesson well: never make it too good. Never give them enough to crave. His casual dates never made it past dinner or drinks. If things escalated, he kept his touch light, his performance adequate, nothing that would leave them begging, nothing that would make them linger. He'd had enough of being needed. Now, the offer letter on his table gleamed under the lamplight, a senior executive position in Atlanta, with a salary that dwarfed anything he'd earned before. A fresh start. A new city. No ghosts. He tapped his tablet screen, finalizing the moving company's schedule. His belongings were sparse, he'd learned to live with little, to hold only what served him. No excess. No attachments. The cabin boy was dead. The captain had his ship. And the horizon? It was wide open. Jonathan closed his laptop, picked up his keys, and walked out the door without looking back.